"Nobody wants you," his brother sneered, the cruel words echoing through the opulent ballroom as high society's elite watched in silence. But as a rogue tear slipped down the Omega's cheek, an intoxicating, suffocating scent of dark cedar silenced the room. The Alpha King was crossing the floor. For him. In the cutthroat world of Manhattan commercial real estate, secondary genders were the unspoken currency that dictated a person's ceiling. Alphas were the rainmakers, the CEOs, the aggressive negotiators who closed billion-dollar acquisitions over scotch and rare steaks. Betas were the reliable foundation, the lawyers and accountants who kept the machine running. And Omegas, in families like the Reynolds, Omegas were meant to be beautiful, docile, and married off to secure lucrative mergers. Orland Reynolds was none of those things. At 24, Orland was the second son of Richard Reynolds, the ruthless founder of Reynolds Premier Estates. For the first 18 years of his life, Orland had been presumed a beta. He was quiet, intellectually gifted, and lacked the aggressive pheromones of his older brother, Agaton. But a late, violent presentation during his freshman year at Columbia University had rewritten his destiny. He was an Omega, but a physically unremarkable one by the twisted standards of their society. His scent was faint, his build was lean rather than soft, and he possessed a stubborn, analytical mind that his father found deeply unappealing in an Omega. "You're a biological disappointment and a social liability," his father had told him on his 19th birthday. "If you can't be traded, you will work, but you will remain out of sight." And so Orland became the invisible ghost of Reynolds Premier Estates, while his older brother Agaton, a textbook prime alpha with a jawline carved from granite and an ego to match, was paraded around Wall Street as the heir apparent. Orland was locked in the windowless basement archives. He was the one who scoured through zoning laws, restructured the debt portfolios, and built the flawless financial models that Agaton presented to the board. Agaton took the credit, the bonuses, and the glory. Orland took the heavy, government-mandated scent suppressants that left him chronically nauseous and plagued by migraines, just to ensure he didn't distract the alphas on the executive floors. The dynamic reached its breaking point during the winter quarter. Reynolds Premier was aggressively pursuing a joint venture with Vanguard Holdings, a monstrously successful international conglomerate moving its headquarters to New York. Securing the Vanguard contract meant securing the Reynolds legacy for the next century. The CEO of Vanguard Holdings was Drayden Vanguard. Drayden was an enigma, an apex alpha who had built his empire from the ground up rather than inheriting it. He was notorious for his ruthless efficiency, his impenetrable poker face, and a presence so dominant that lesser alphas routinely broke into cold sweats in his boardrooms. He was the undisputed king of the city's corporate ecosystem. For 3 weeks, Orland had slept on a miserable cot in his office, surviving on cold espresso and sheer willpower to draft the Vanguard proposal. He cross-referenced European tax loopholes, analyzed 15 years of Vanguard's acquisition history, and created a pitch so ironclad it was practically a work of art. When he finally handed the heavy leather-bound dossier to Agaton on a rainy Tuesday morning, his hands were trembling from exhaustion. "It's all here," Orland rasped, adjusting his glasses. "The key is the leverage on the Hudson Yards property. Vanguard wants sustainability. I've reallocated the budget to highlight green certifications without cutting into the profit margins. Just read the executive summary, Agaton. Please." Agaton didn't even look at him. He snatched the folder, his sharp, peppery alpha scent spiking with irritation. "I know how to pitch a damn deal, Orland. Just go back to your basement and make sure your suppressants are topped up. You smell like stale paper and pity." Orland swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding tightly. He was used to the cruelty. It was a survival mechanism to just absorb it and move on. The Vanguard Gala was scheduled for that Friday evening at the Waldorf Astoria. It was an exclusive masquerade ball celebrating Vanguard Holdings' official relocation, doubling as the final networking arena before Drayden Vanguard announced his chosen partners for the upcoming quarter. The guest list was a who's who of global finance. Naturally, Orland was not invited. He was explicitly ordered by his father to stay home, out of sight, while Agaton attended to woo Drayden Vanguard in person. Friday night arrived with a torrential downpour. Orland was in his cramped Brooklyn apartment, wearing an oversized sweater and nursing a cup of cheap chamomile tea, finally allowing his scent, a subtle, clean fragrance of rain-washed jasmine and white tea, to drift freely without blockers. He was just starting to relax when his phone began to vibrate violently on the coffee table. It was Agaton. "Orland, where the hell is the contingency file?" Agaton's voice was a frantic snarl over the loud, thumping bass of a string quartet in the background. "The contingency file? I put it in the digital drive, in the folder marked." "I don't have access to the drive, you idiot! I left my secure tablet in the town car, and the driver took it to the depot," Agaton roared, the panic evident in his voice. "Vanguard's CFO is asking about our liquidity projections for the second quarter. I need the hard copy, now." "Agaton, it's pouring rain, and I'm not dressed for—" "I don't care," Agaton screamed. "Get to the Waldorf Astoria in 20 minutes with that file, or I swear to God, Orland, I will have Dad cut off your medical insurance. Let's see how you afford your specialized suppressants then. Get here." The line went dead. Orland stared at the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. His medical insurance was his lifeline. The specialized suppressants kept his irregular, painful preheats at bay. He had no choice. He rushed to his closet, pulling out his only suit, a cheap, charcoal grey two-piece that he had bought off the rack years ago. It didn't fit quite right, hanging loosely on his slender frame. He grabbed his worn leather briefcase, popped an extra suppressant pill dry, and ran out into the storm. The Waldorf Astoria was a fortress of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and intoxicating power. Even standing in the grand foyer, soaked to the bone from the 3-block run from the subway, Orland could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of hundreds of dominant alphas gathered in one space. It made his skin prickle, a deep biological warning bells ringing in his mind to flee. He approached the velvet ropes, clutching his briefcase to his chest. The security guards, massive betas with earpieces, looked at his dripping hair and cheap suit with open disdain. "I'm here for Agaton Reynolds," Orland said, his voice shaking slightly. "I have secure documents for him. It's a corporate emergency." One guard checked an iPad, frowning. "Reynolds, right. He said a courier was coming. Back entrance through the kitchen, wait by the service doors of the grand ballroom." Orland nodded numbly, enduring the humiliation of being treated as hired help rather than the son of the company's founder. He navigated the chaotic, stainless steel labyrinth of the hotel kitchens, the smell of truffles and roasted meats turning his already churning stomach. The extra suppressant pill was fighting a losing battle against his spiking adrenaline and the overwhelming pheromones bleeding through the walls of the ballroom. He finally reached the service doors, pushing them open just a crack. The sight was dazzling. Women in thousands of dollars of haute couture and men in bespoke tuxedos milled about, sipping champagne. And there, standing near an ice sculpture, was Agaton, holding court with a group of younger, lesser alphas. Taking a deep breath, Orland slipped through the doors. He just needed to hand over the file and leave. He kept his head down, weaving through the glittering crowd, trying to be as invisible as he had trained himself to be. "Agaton," Orland murmured, stepping up behind his brother. Agaton spun around, his charismatic smile instantly morphing into a scowl of pure disgust. "What took you so long? And look at you, you're dripping wet. You're getting puddle water on my Gucci shoes." "The subway was delayed," Orland said quietly, opening the briefcase and handing over the thick, sealed envelope. "Here are the liquidity projections. I highlighted the key metrics for the CFO." Agaton snatched the envelope, but instead of dismissing Orland, a cruel, drunken light danced in his eyes. He had been drinking heavy scotch, and his alpha scent was sharp, arrogant, and mean. He looked around at his friends, a group of wealthy heirs who lived off trust funds. "Look at this, gentlemen," Agaton sneered loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding guests. "My pathetic little brother, the family secret." Orland froze, his eyes widening. "Agaton, please. I brought the file. Let me just go." "Go where? Back to your miserable little apartment?" Agaton laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He stepped closer, deliberately invading Orland's space, using his physical size to intimidate him. "Do you know Vanguard's people were asking who ran the financial models? I told them I did, because if they knew a defective, unbonded, scentless Omega like you touched their accounts, they'd pull out of the deal immediately." Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. High society loved a scandal, and the Reynolds airing their dirty laundry was prime entertainment. "Agaton, stop," Orland whispered, his vision blurring with unshed tears. The stress, the exhaustion, and the sheer terror of the public humiliation were wreaking havoc on his nervous system. Deep in his abdomen, a sharp, twisting cramp seized him. The suppressants, they were failing under the immense psychological pressure. "Stop? Why?" Agaton's voice boomed, projecting across the quietening room. "You need to learn your place, Orland. You walk in here looking like a drowned rat, thinking you belong in the same room as us. You're a biological dead end. You're weak, you're ugly, and your scent is so pathetic you might as well be a broken beta. Look around." Agaton gestured wildly to the crowd. "Nobody wants you. You are nothing but a tool for my success." The words struck Orland like physical blows. He took a step back, his breath hitching. A rogue tear escaped, slipping down his pale cheek. The humiliation was absolute, suffocating him. But then, something in Sir Orland broke. Or rather, something snapped open. The artificial chemical dam of his suppressants completely shattered. Driven by raw emotional trauma and the biological need to protect himself, his dormant Omega nature violently flared to life. It wasn't the weak, scentless profile his father had always mocked. It was a sudden, explosive wave of pure, unadulterated pheromones. The scent of rain-drenched jasmine, sharp white tea, and a desperate, underlying sweetness flooded the immediate vicinity. It was so potent, so achingly pure, that it hit the surrounding alphas like a physical shockwave. Several men physically stumbled back, their eyes dilating, their own sense spiking in sudden, uncoordinated confusion. Agaton's arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer shock as the intoxicating scent hit his nostrils. What the hell did you just do?" he stammered, stepping away as if burned. Suddenly, the ambient chatter in the vast ballroom died completely. The string quartet faltered and stopped playing. The crowd parted near the grand entrance, splitting like the Red Sea. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, replaced by an overwhelming, terrifying scent of dark cedar, ozone, and impending thunderstorms. It was an alpha presence so dominant, so absolute, that it forced several younger alphas to instinctively lower their heads and avert their eyes. Drayden Vanguard had entered the room. He was a towering figure in a midnight blue tuxedo, his broad shoulders and sharp, aristocratic features radiating a dangerous stillness. His dark, piercing eyes swept the room, cutting through the crowd until they locked onto the epicenter of the jasmine scent. They locked onto Orland. For a second that stretched into eternity, the world stopped spinning. Orland, trembling violently, clutching his empty briefcase to his chest, stared back into the dark, stormy eyes of the Alpha King. He expected disgust. He expected to be thrown out. Instead, a low, rumbling growl vibrated through the silent ballroom. It was a sound of absolute, possessive fury, not directed at Orland, but at the man standing over him. Without a word, Drayden Vanguard bypassed the mayor, ignored the desperate greetings of Fortune 500 CEOs, and began crossing the floor. His strides were long, deliberate, and terrifying. The elite crowd scrambled out of his path, practically pressing themselves against the walls to avoid the radiating heat of his anger. He was walking straight toward Agaton, straight toward Orland. The silence in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was deafening, save for the rhythmic, heavy thud of Drayden Vanguard's Italian leather shoes against the polished marble floor. Every alpha, beta, and omega in the room held their breath, caught in the suffocating undertow of Drayden's pheromones. The scent of dark cedar and ozone was no longer just a presence. It was a physical weight, a predatory warning that commanded absolute submission. Agaton Reynolds, who mere moments ago had been reveling in his own cruelty, suddenly looked very small. The scotch in his glass trembled as his arrogant swagger evaporated. He tried to puff out his chest to project his own peppery alpha scent in a futile display of dominance. But against the sheer force of Drayden Vanguard, it was like a match trying to outshine a wildfire. Drayden did not even look at Agaton initially. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from Orland. The towering billionaire looked down at the soaked, trembling Omega clutching a cheap briefcase. Up close, Drayden's eyes were a startling, fathomless slate gray, storm-swept and intense. Orland was paralyzed. His chest heaved as his suppressants failed utterly, his body instinctively responding to the apex alpha before him. The scent of rain-drenched jasmine poured from Orland in distressed waves, a desperate biological plea for safety. Slowly, deliberately, Drayden reached out. He didn't grab Orland. Instead, his large, warm hand gently cupped the side of Orland's face, his thumb softly brushing away the solitary tear that had fallen. The touch was electric, sending a jolt of pure, fiery heat straight down Orland's spine. The bone-deep chill of the rain and the humiliation vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifyingly profound sense of belonging. "You are shaking!" Drayden's voice was a deep, resonant baritone that vibrated in Orland's chest. It wasn't a question, but a quiet, furious observation. Before Orland could find the breath to reply, Agaton, desperate to salvage the situation and completely misreading the room, stepped forward. "Mr. Vanguard," Agaton stammered, plastering on a fake, obsequious smile. "I apologize for this disturbance." This is my younger brother, Orland. He's unwell, a bit unstable. I was just sending him home so we could discuss the Hudson Yards proposal. I have the liquidity projections right here, which I compiled myself. Drayden's head snapped toward Agaton. The movement was so predatory, so sharply aggressive, that Agaton physically flinched, stumbling backward and knocking his drink into a passing waiter. "You compiled them yourself?" Drayden asked, his voice dropping an octave, deadly quiet and infinitely more terrifying than a shout. Yes, sir." "Of course," Agaton lied, though sweat was now beading on his forehead. "I spent the last 3 weeks perfecting the financial models for our joint venture. Reynolds Premier is fully prepared to—" "Fascinating," Drayden interrupted, his tone laced with a dark, mocking velvet. "Because when my analysts at Kroll Incorporated audited your proposal yesterday, they noticed something highly unusual. The tax mitigation strategy utilizes a highly aggressive Section 1031 exchange nested within a Delaware statutory trust. It's a brilliant, remarkably obscure maneuver that saved the portfolio from a 14% capital gains hemorrhage." Drayden took a single step toward Agaton. The cedar scent spiked with pure, unfiltered hostility. "Explain the mechanics of that trust to me right now, Agaton," Drayden commanded, his voice ringing out across the dead, silent ballroom. "Explain the depreciation recapture parameters. Tell this entire room how you structured it." Agaton's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked wildly around the room, making eye contact with his father, Richard Reynolds, who was rushing through the crowd, looking equally pale and horrified. Well, the depreciation it's standard, sir. My team and I—" "You don't know," Drayden stated, his disgust palpable. He turned his back on Agaton, dismissing the man entirely, and looked back down at Orland. The harsh lines of Drayden's face softened miraculously. "But you do, don't you?" Orland blinked, his analytical mind piercing through the haze of his Omega instincts. The recapture parameters are deferred indefinitely under the DST structure, provided the replacement property maintains a debt-to-equity ratio of at least 60-40, Orland whispered, his voice trembling, but his financial acumen flawless. "I routed the surplus liquidity into the Vanguard Green Certification initiatives to offset the remaining tax liabilities." A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. High society was built on secrets, but seeing the golden heir of the Reynolds empire publicly exposed as a fraud, while the defective Omega spouted high-level corporate tax law, was a scandal of biblical proportions. A slow, devastatingly beautiful smirk spread across Drayden's face. He looked at Orland, not just with the raw, possessive hunger of an alpha, but with the profound respect of an equal. "I knew the mind behind that proposal didn't belong to a Reynolds," Drayden said softly, his eyes locked on Orland's. "I have been looking for the architect of this portfolio for 3 weeks. I just didn't expect to find him shivering in a wetsuit, being insulted by a parasite." "Mr. Vanguard, please, this is a family matter." Richard Reynolds finally reached them, his face purple with rage and embarrassment. "Orland is a heavily medicated Omega who doesn't know his place. He stole those numbers. I demand you let my security escort him out." Drayden shifted smoothly, placing himself entirely between Orland and Richard Reynolds. The protective stance was undeniable. Drayden unbuttoned his bespoke midnight blue suit jacket and shrugged it off. With agonizing care, he draped the heavy, silk-lined jacket over Orland's trembling shoulders. The scent of Drayden, pure, concentrated alpha cedar and safety, wrapped around Orland like a fortress, instantly soothing the painful cramps in his abdomen and silencing the roaring panic in his head. "He isn't going anywhere with your security, Richard," Drayden said, his voice echoing with finality. "And Reynolds Premier Estates is no longer a candidate for the Vanguard joint venture. In fact, as of Monday morning, I am initiating a hostile takeover of your firm. By the end of the fiscal quarter, your company will be liquidated, and your legacy will be nothing but a footnote in my acquisition files." Richard staggered back, clutching his chest. Agaton looked as if he was going to vomit. Drayden didn't wait for their replies. He turned back to Orland, offering his arm with the elegant, old-world courtesy of a king addressing royalty. "Mr. Reynolds," Drayden murmured, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive light, "would you do me the honor of allowing me to escort you out of this miserable room?" Orland looked from his stunned, ruined family to the alpha who had just shattered his entire miserable reality, and offered him the world. Trembling, Orland reached out, slipping his hand into the crook of Drayden's arm. "Yes," Orland breathed. Together, they walked out of the Waldorf Astoria. The crowd parted for them in absolute, stunned silence, the scent of cedar and jasmine swirling together, an indomitable storm leaving nothing but destruction in its wake. Orland awoke to the soft, diffused light of a Sunday morning, filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling, emerald expanse of Central Park. He was tangled in sheets of thousand-thread-count Egyptian cotton, wearing a charcoal t-shirt that was entirely too large for him and smelled intoxicatingly of Drayden. For a brief, terrifying second, Orland's heart hammered. He expected to wake up in his dingy Brooklyn apartment, the events at the gala, a cruel, feverish hallucination brought on by suppressant withdrawal. But as he sat up, the dull ache in his head was gone, his scent was balanced, and the reality of the Vanguard penthouse grounded him. The bedroom door clicked open. Drayden stood in the doorway, dressed casually, in dark slacks and a fitted grey sweater, holding a silver tray with a steaming porcelain teapot and a plate of fresh pastries. He paused, his dark eyes sweeping over Orland, visibly checking for any signs of distress. "You've slept for 36 hours, Drayden said softly, setting the tray down on the nightstand. "My private physician came by yesterday. Your system was in severe shock from the artificial suppressants. She flushed the toxins from your bloodstream. You are completely safe here, Orland." Orland pulled the plush duvet up to his chest, suddenly hyper-aware of his unsuppressed Omega scent filling the Alpha's bedroom. "Why?" he rasped, his voice thick with sleep and disbelief. "Why did you do all of that? You ruined my father's company. You humiliated Agaton. Over a proposal." Drayden sat on the edge of the mattress. He didn't crowd Orland, maintaining a respectful distance, though the subtle darkening of his eyes betrayed his deep, instinctual desire to pull the Omega into a nest. "It wasn't just over a proposal, Orland," Drayden said quietly, pouring a cup of chamomile tea and handing it to him. "When Vanguard Holdings decided to move to New York, I thoroughly vetted every major player in the city. I despise incompetence, and I despise bullies. Your father and brother are both." Drayden leaned back, crossing his arms. "Months ago, I intercepted a brilliantly structured risk assessment file on the Goldman Sachs merger. It was buried in a Reynolds subfolder, unsigned. Then came the Hudson Yards proposal, the mathematical modeling, the intuition, the sheer elegance of the financial structuring. It was a work of genius. I knew Aunt Agaton Reynolds was incapable of it. He is a blunt instrument. So I hired private investigators to find the ghost who was actually running Reynolds Premier." Orland stared at him, the teacup trembling slightly in his hands. You were looking for me, before the gala." "I was," Drayden confessed, a soft, rare smile touching his lips. "I expected to find a brilliant, overworked beta hiding in a cubicle. I fully intended to poach you, pay you 10 times your salary, and crush your father's firm for stealing your labor." Drayden's gaze dropped to Orland's lips, then back to his eyes. The cedar scent in the room thickened, growing warmer, intimately sweet. What I did not expect was to walk into that ballroom and have my entire biological reality rewritten in a fraction of a second. The moment your suppressants broke. Orland, I couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed that you belonged to me, and that the man threatening you needed to be torn apart. A profound, aching warmth bloomed in Orland's chest. For his entire life, his secondary gender had been a curse, a mark of shame. He was told he was unwanted, defective. Yet here was the most powerful alpha in the Western Hemisphere, looking at him as if he hung the stars in the sky. "I don't have anything," Orland whispered, looking down at his lap. "My father cut off my accounts yesterday. I checked my phone. I have no job, no money, and I am an unbonded Omega who just publicly destroyed his family's reputation." "You have everything," Drayden corrected gently. He reached out, slowly running his knuckles down Orland's cheek. The touch made Orland lean into the hand instinctively, a soft, involuntary purr vibrating in his throat. Drayden's breath hitched at the sound. "You are not going back to them," Drayden stated, his voice a low rumble of absolute certainty. "Tomorrow, the Vanguard acquisition team begins the hostile takeover of Reynolds Premier. I want you to head the integration process. You know their books better than anyone. When the dust settles, you will take your rightful place as the Chief Financial Officer of Vanguard's North American Real Estate Division." Orland's head snapped up, his jaw dropping. "Drayden, I'm an Omega. The board won't accept an Omega CFO. The board will accept whoever I tell them to accept, or I will replace them all," Drayden said ruthlessly. But then his expression softened, shifting from the ruthless CEO to a devoted alpha. He shifted closer, resting his forehead gently against Orland's. "But that is just business, Orland. Right now, I have a more pressing concern." Drayden's voice was a rough whisper against Orland's lips. "I want to court you. Properly. No suppressants, no hiding. I want to take you to dinner. I want to learn every brilliant thought in your head. And when you are ready, I want to bond with you and make you mine in every way a mate can be. If you will have me." Nobody had ever asked for Orland's consent. Nobody had ever wanted him. Not just his mind, not just his compliance, but all of him. Tears welled in Orland's eyes, but this time they were not born of humiliation or pain. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. He let the teacup rattle back onto the tray and threw his arms around Drayden's neck. The alpha let out a deep, satisfied growl, wrapping his powerful arms around Orland's waist and pulling him flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of Orland's neck to inhale the sweet, rain-washed jasmine. 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline looked remarkably different. Reynolds Premier Estates was legally dissolved, its assets absorbed entirely into Vanguard Holdings. Richard Reynolds had retired in disgrace to Florida, and Agaton, stripped of his trust fund and his unearned prestige, was working a grueling, mid-level sales job at a strip mall brokerage in New Jersey. And high above the city, in the glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Holdings, the new chief financial officer stood at the head of the mahogany table. Orland Vanguard, wearing a sharply tailored Tom Ford suit that perfectly accentuated his frame, a platinum bonding mark resting securely over his scent gland, pointed to the projected financial models on the screen. His scent, a perfect intoxicating blend of sharp jasmine and dark protective cedar, commanded the absolute respect of every alpha and beta in the room. He was no longer a ghost. He was the king's mate, the architect of an empire, and he was finally, undeniably, seen. Did this intensely dramatic Omegaverse tale of corporate revenge, hidden genius, and fated mates keep you on the edge of your seat? The Alpha King didn't just save Orland, he helped him claim his rightful throne. If you loved this satisfying story of toxic family karma and a billionaire alpha who knows how to treat his Omega, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe for more thrilling original stories.